Good afternoon. My name is Brett Wright, and I'll be your MC this afternoon. Welcome to the 41st Annual George B. Hartzog Jr. Environmental Lecture. Earlier today, through the generosity of many, many donors to the George Hartzog Endowment, we recognized 6 outstanding professionals who have dedicated their professional lives to managing and protecting our nation's parks. If I could ask each of them to stand briefly and be recognized. The Benton H. Box Award is presented each year to a teacher who by precept and example inspires in students the quest for knowledge and inculcates an environmental ethic as a rule of conduct. This year's Box Award was presented to 2 distinguished scholars, Dr. Ron Sharp, a professor at Kansas State University who unfortunately had a weather delay in a plane and couldn't get here, and to Dr. Steve Trombulak, professor emeritus at Middlebury College. Please recognize Steve. Can you stand? The William C. Everhart Award was given to Dr. Carolyn Ward, Executive Director of the Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation. The award recognizes sustained achievements during a career or in a specific episode that illuminate, provide insights to, and fosters an appreciation of our natural and cultural heritage. The Dwight A. Holder Award, that award was given to Dr. Carolyn Ward. Carolyn? The Dwight A. Holder Award recognizes outstanding work by doctoral students from Clemson, either in the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management or the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation. That award is for original research, scholarly writing, and innovative inspired teaching. This year's Dwight Holder Award is presented to Dr. Jen Thompson of the University of Montana. Jen? The Fran P. Manella Award recognizes sustained and innovative achievement by a woman in the management of North America's natural, historic, and cultural heritage. The Fran P. Manella Award for 2019 was presented to Ms. Chris Leinertz, CEO of the Golden Gate National Park Conservancy in San Francisco. Congratulations, Chris. Won't you join me? Let's give them all a round of applause. Thank you very much. Earlier today, I reminded our audience and everyone of the heritage of the Hartzog Lecture and all the distinguished people who have given it over the years. We've had cabinet secretaries, senators, congressmen, noted authors, scientists, filmmakers, and we have had every national park director since Director Hartzog himself in the early 70s. Today we continue that tradition, and we're very proud to do so. Our 2019 Hartzog Lecturer is a native Texan and a proud graduate of Texas A&M University. David Vela began his NPS career in 1981 as a cooperative education student at San Antonio Missions National Historic Park in Texas, and later became a permanent park ranger. He has been a dedicated public servant his entire professional life and is a 29-year veteran of the National Park Service. On October 1st, David Vela was named NPS Deputy Director for Operations, acting with the authority of the Director. Mr. Vela is now responsible for 419 national park units and a workforce of over 20,000 employees. He has served in leadership positions throughout the national park system. Most recently, he served as superintendent of Grand Tetons National Park, where he managed more than 310,000 acres of parklands, including the spectacular Teton Range that serve as home to many iconic wildlife from bison to grizzly bears, as well as 51 miles of the wild and scenic Snake River. He has held many other leadership positions within the NPS, including being Associate Director for Workforce Relevancy and Inclusion, Director of the Southeast Region in Atlanta, Superintendent of Palo Alto Battlefield, the Lyndon Baines Johnson National Historic Park in Texas, and the George Washington Memorial Parkway in Virginia. David and his wife, Melissa, have 2 children, Christina and Anthony, and 6 grandchildren. His son, Anthony, was recently named Chief Ranger at Castillo de San Marcos National Monument Park in St. Augustine, Florida. And that apple hasn't fallen very far from the tree. So I know that David's very proud of his whole family, and Anthony continues that tradition. Today, Mr. Vela will discuss NPS Next, a second century of service. So as we start, I'll ask you to give him a round of applause in a minute. We have a short video, and then we'll bring David out. Thank you.
Yeah, we're beautiful. America's best idea. The greatest of America's natural landscapes. Our revered cultural heritage. And our most important historical lessons. A mosaic of what we Americans value about our places, ourselves, and each other. We serve as guardians of many of our nation's greatest treasures. And the tellers of our collective stories. We honor the best of who we are as a nation and seek lessons in our country's imperfections. Our role is not to define for others, but to inspire discovery, to question our assumptions, to uphold our nation's democratic principles, and to challenge each other to rise above what was and achieve the ideal of what can be. So, who are we? And what do we believe about ourselves? Ours are the faces of many peoples, the bearers of many identities. We are public servants, fiercely dedicated public servants. And we believe in the power of our mission. We see how our work connects to the greater good. We are passionate about what we do. We are courageous. We welcome challenges. We strive to create opportunities for everyone to connect with their parks. We support local communities. We are stewards. We are family. We are ambassadors. We are all of this because we believe that we did not inherit, but we borrow from our future. Yeah, we are beautiful. America's best idea. But is believing in who we are enough? Are we connecting with the next generation? Do we learn from our own diversity? Have we truly ensured that all people feel invited, included, and engaged? Can we risk not meeting the needs of an increasingly diverse America? To be America's best, we need to go out and invite new audiences. Share the difficult stories. Meet the needs of an ever-evolving society. Confront our discomfort. Realize that many people value our mission as much as we do. Harness the power of our own diversity seek opinions different than our own, really listen, be willing to implement new ideas, be flexible, build meaningful connections with others, and embrace change as an opportunity to learn and grow. Relevancy, diversity, and inclusion are pillars. They are values and practices for connecting the public to our mission and fulfilling our obligation to steward our nation's natural and cultural heritage. Discussing and debating these values embodies our democratic ideals and strengthens our role in society. Listen, share, join in the discussion. We're all in this together. We are the National Park Service.
Well, good afternoon. I want to thank Brett and the whole Clemson family for an amazing day today and talking about the prevailing issues that impact leaders, park leaders at every level of government. I commissioned that video about 6 years ago because I wanted to do two things. One is to celebrate our workforce and all the different jobs that they do, whether they're electricians or plumbers or budget officers or United States Park Police officers, that we are all one National Park Service family. And the second objective of developing that video was to encourage the next generation to want to come to be a part of America's best idea, the National Park Service. What I'd like to do is to take just a moment to acknowledge and recognize all of the Park Service employees, whether you're a retired employee, whether you're currently a seasonal, a volunteer, or a member of our permanent staff. If you do me a favor, please stand and be recognized. These individuals have chosen to take on causes greater than themselves. To protect our nation's birthright and our heritage is what we are all about. Whether you're at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, it is about our national heritage. Let me start off by providing some perspective about who I am and how I began this journey to Washington, D.C. as acting director of the National Park Service. Back in the late 1960s, my family and I have a younger brother and younger sister, are from Southeast Texas, south of Houston. And one day, I'll never forget, I was a teenager, and my parents said, guys, we're going to take a trip. Now, granted, we were not a family of financial means, but we were rich in faith and rich in family and rich in exploration. So one day, our parents said, we're going to go to Yellowstone. And I'll never forget my brother and sister and I saying, what's Yellowstone? Because we had no perspective, no concept of what a national park was all about. None. Probably the nearest national park was probably Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park. That's another story we'll get to in a minute. Big Bend was like 8 hours down the road in South Texas, so we didn't have a concept of national parks. Maybe state parks at Bastrop State Park, which is one of the big state parks outside of Austin, Texas. So there we go. And I remember how Mom would, back in the 60s, today they're called buffets. Back in the day, and the baby boomers will know what I'm talking about, they were called smorgasbords. Remember that? Find those smorgasbords, which was great because you can eat whatever you want. You know, and Mom quickly realized that she had to stay behind me because I would go after the meats. There was no vegetables, it was just go after the protein. But we would eat at smorgasbords, but Mom would buy loaves of white bread and bags of Fritos just to make ends meet. And it's amazing how even today, when I slip in a bag of Fritos away from my wife while I'm eating a sandwich, When I open up that bag of Fritos, I think of that trip to Yellowstone. It's amazing how the power of senses really keeps with you. But here's what's fascinating about that journey. The first national park that we stopped at was Grand Teton National Park. And I remember when we pulled up, there were two things that became obvious to me. One was, there's no people that look like us in this place. They're Latinos. And there were no rangers that looked like us. And then when we found out that there might be grizzly bears in the park, we're like, oh no, it's time to go. But we realized quickly that, wait a minute, we got to chill out. You know, we pay taxes, we're taxpayers, that, hey, this is part of our national heritage, it's part of our birthright. So, you know, we belong there. And once we started to be comfortable being in a wild place, we started to enjoy it. But something else happened. When I had my first view of a national park ranger wearing that green and gray uniform with that funny Smokey the Bear hat, a shiny gold badge, and a gun. And as a teenager, that was fascinating to me. That, wait a minute, you can work in a place like this, and you can live in a place like this, and get paid to be in a place like this? I quickly realized when I got back from that journey what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And as I started doing research, because we didn't have internet, we didn't have computers back in those days, we had encyclopedias and Popular Mechanics magazine and other outdoor magazines. And so I credit where I am today to a number of people, but to an assistant librarian who recognized my enthusiasm and would send out for articles about what it was going to be like to be a park ranger and the qualifications that you needed to have through magazine articles. And one of the things I remember reading was about having to give public speaking and being proficient with communication skills. As a Latino from Southeast Texas, when I was in high school, there were two things I was interested in: playing football and going after my kindergarten classmate, later high school sweetheart, and now bride of 39 years. Those were the only two things that mattered to me. And I pursued both of them pretty vigorously. And I was successful in both of them. But when I realized that, wait a minute, I can't do public speaking. Are you kidding me? Until one day, the drama teacher in Wharton High School, Miss Hoover, I was fortunate, I wasn't, my wife was all state in band and I was all state in choir. And my drama teacher, later became my drama teacher, said, "Dave, I really want you to think about being in theater." I'm like, really? Latino, you know, in the 70s? Come on. He said, no, you're really going to like it. And I'll never forget it was the production of Little Abner. And I played the crazy doctor. And lo and behold, I got hooked. And I loved it. And loved it so much that I minored in college in theater. So this is familiar territory to me. I'm very comfortable in being on stages now and doing public speaking. But one of the most memorable experiences I had in theater in college was playing the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz. Now, I'll tell you a story. We had sold-out performances. And I never had any intent of being an actor. I just wanted to be able to learn how to do public speaking. And one of the scenes in The Wizard of Oz is the Tin Man is behind a tree, and the Wicked Witch of the West, say that 3 times, comes from one stage to the other on a rope, right? Well, I'm behind the tree, and I'm like, no, this tree doesn't look like it's in the right place, so I happen to move it just a little bit. Yeah, you know where I'm going. In the middle of the scene, the Wicked Witch hits a tree. And the tree falls down, and I'm like, it happened. But there were memorable experiences of just being on a stage and just feeling comfortable with yourself, and boy, has it served me well. Actually, I leave at 6 o'clock in the morning tomorrow to go to Utah to give a speech before the outdoor recreation conference in Utah. So I credit that high school librarian and I credit that theater teacher for giving me the confidence to be able to do public speaking and to be able to fulfill that in the green and gray of the National Park Service. And I remember when I was nominated by the president to be the 19th director of the National Park Service, I was getting ready for my hearing in the Senate. And I asked my dad and my parents, guys, why did we make that trip to Yellowstone? And it was fascinating what my parents said. My dad obtained his master's degree in social work at the University of Michigan in the early 70s. So we lived in Ann Arbor in the 70s. That was quite the experience. And he said, son, he worked in a sulfur company. He worked the graveyard shift. And he said, I was just hearing my coworkers talk about Yellowstone. And I didn't want to deny my own children that opportunity to experience Yellowstone, which we did. And I think about that often of what would I be doing today if my parents had not made that decision? I had probably two options afterwards. I was born on a naval base. My dad was in the Navy. I probably would be in the Navy, just enjoy the Navy and the history of the Navy. But we chose the park ranger track because of that trip. So here's an example, my friends, of the power and the influence of national parks. One trip, one experience literally changed my life. And I stand humbly before you as the acting director of the National Park Service because of that trip and the decisions that my parents made to provide their children with that experience. I'll never forget that. Now I've had the opportunity of raising 2 children in the national parks and now 6 grandchildren. And it caught on with our son, who we are all graduates of Texas A&M. In fact, I was actually interviewed by A&M yesterday, and there are 3 questions that they asked me. What role and influence did my experience at Texas A&M, plug in Clemson, plug in Slippery Rock, plug in Penn State, all the schools that have been renowned over the years for recreation, parks, and tourism sciences. Second question they ask is, what experience in your public service career, because I had 8 years as a senior executive at the state level running a state law enforcement agency in Texas for the Attorney General. I was a criminal IG special agent in New York City doing white-collar crime in the streets of New York City. That was quite an experience. In addition to working with the late U.S. Congressman Mickey Leland, who died tragically in a plane crash in Ethiopia, and I held local elected office. So I've had an opportunity, and some may say, dude, you can't hold down a job. Well, it's those jobs that have positioned me to do the things that I'm doing today. An amazing set of experiences. Now our son is a chief ranger, as Brett mentioned, in one of our units in Florida, and he actually met his wife. They were both training in Grand Teton National Park. So from that initial experience to one day serving as the 21st superintendent of Grand Teton National Park, the very park that changed my life. And can you imagine, for over 5 years, you live in the superintendent's residence, and every room in the residence is picturing the Grand Teton and the Grand Teton Range. And you wake up in the morning and there's elk and moose literally in your backyard. It was an amazing blessing. But I quickly realized as superintendent that I was not in charge. Brett mentioned the iconic wildlife that comprises Grand Teton: bison, elk, moose, grizzly, and black bears. And one particular day, how many of you remember the movie The Revenant? Remember that with Leonardo DiCaprio? Remember that movie? It's based on the life of Jim Bridger and Glass, who were mountain men in the Teton ecosystem. And you remember the scene where Leonardo DiCaprio was attacked by the grizzly. I want you to keep that in mind. So one day, I'm I have some friends from Washington, D.C., and I was taking them around. It was a weekend. I was not in uniform, and I did not have bear spray with me. If you are an employee of Grand Teton, if you're a volunteer or seasonal, you will carry bear spray, mandatory. And if you've never seen bear spray, it's about this big, and it costs about $45 a can, and you only get 4 seconds of help in that bear spray. So you got to know how to use it. And so this one particular day, I was taking some friends and to a historic structure, and I saw bear 610. Now, not all the bears in Grand Teton are numbered, but there are a couple famous bears, bear number 399, and then 610 is the offspring of 399. Now, I want you to understand that these grizzly bears have Facebook pages. I don't have Facebook pages, but the bears do, because, I mean, they're worldwide phenomenon. I mean, people track what they're doing and the offspring. Well, this was bear number 610, the offspring of 399, and we were at this historic residence, and I saw him in the backyard, and she had 2 cubs, and I knew she was going to, before she got to the dam, she was going to have to cross the street, and keep the movie The Revenant in your mind thinking. And so, sure enough, I said, let's go catch them, because let's see them when they cross the road. Well, there were about 10 cars that were lined up on the road, and they were out of the vehicle because they had heard or seen the bears moving towards the dam, and they were going to have to cross the street. So I pulled up and said, hi, folks, Superintendent, Grand Teton National Park, welcome, we're glad to have you. Hey, just want you to know that the 2 bears are going to cross the street any minute. And as soon as I said any minute, 610 in her full glory, she's huge, is on the road. Now, you're supposed to be 100 yards between yourself and a bear, which is a football length of a football field. That's true for bears, moose, the big ungulates. You're supposed to be a long distance away. This particular case, I was less than 40 yards. No bear spray. As soon as I said what I said, I turned around, and there's 610. I'm like, oh my gosh. And I'm not kidding, guys. What seemed to be hours was seconds. And we are literally less than 40 yards away, eye to eye. She's looking at me. She's staring me down. And there are 2 thoughts that came to my mind. Girlfriend, you got to chill. This is the superintendent. Don't make a wrong decision. And I'm locked. I'm eye to eye with her. The second thought that came to my mind was, feet, don't fail me now. Let's go. She bluff charged me, which about from here to here. I mean, a hard bluff charge. And and you never run from bears. You never turn your back on bears. But because the cars were nearby, I said, run, get to your cars. She pushed us back. She knew what she was doing all along to enable the 2 cubs to come on the road and cross the street. So the moral of the story is, yeah, I can be the superintendent, but I ain't in charge. There are other factors that will dictate what you're going to do in the national park. And an iconic place like Yellowstone and Yosemite and Grand Canyon and Grand Teton, yeah, the wildlife rule. And that's the way it was designed, is for the enjoyment and protection of current and future generations. Nowadays, there's probably a 50-50 chance when you go to Yellowstone and Grand Teton that you will see a bear. That is phenomenal and part of the visitor experience. One of the reasons why I chose NPS Next, the second century of service, because we're 3 years into a second century. Many of the Park Service all the Park Service employees were around for the most part for the centennial celebration, the 100-year anniversary. And I remember going through interviews when I was superintendent of Grand Teton. So what's next? What's the next 100 years look like? Well, we'll give you some thoughts about that. There are great opportunities for a second century National Park Service. 419 opportunities to experience your national heritage and to realize and discover stories that you may have never thought about. I know when I started my career in San Antonio, we were the first rangers to open up San Antonio Missions National Historical Park. And it was a fascinating experience. I was 21 years old. There are 4 missions. And I was 21 years old and responsible for Mission San Juan. It was the whole issue of church and state. Like, okay, I remember sitting down with the parish priest. I just graduated from A&M. And, okay, who pays the light bill? Who's going to take care of the lawn? What about that wall that we need to be? I mean, it was fascinating to have an opportunity to navigate those issues. The thing, too, that was quite amazing was the opportunity to learn as a leader. And that, frankly, has helped me today. But that Second Century Park Service is about also learning about your own history, your own cultural history. I learned so much about my Latino heritage in the missions. Also, too, it's quite fascinating because if you're familiar with the Park Service uniform, and again, this was the late 70s, early 80s, it very much looks like the United States Border Patrol. And you're in a Latino community. I remember going into restaurants and that would be full, and then it's like we walk in our uniforms and our flat hats and we're like, where'd everybody go? Ahí viene la migra, here comes Border Patrol. Folks couldn't distinguish between us and the Border Patrol. But over time, we started to build that trust and that relationship with that community. And why is that important? Gateway communities, I learned that in every park that I was a superintendent, especially Grand Teton, also are part of the visitor experience. And you have to make those connections. In Grand Teton, we were dealing with 2 political issues that became political issues, and rightfully so. One was the transportation grid. The transportation grid wasn't designed for the types of vehicles and the volume of traffic that came into the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. We're now at 5 million visitors in Grand Teton National Park. It's only 310,000 acres. 5 million people that are also in those gateway communities. So communities are also having to staff up and provide amenities in order to help facilitate the visitor experience. And I learned that from an early age about how it's important to build those relationships. And as acting director, I can assure you, in a Second Century National Park Service, that's going to be critical as we talk about our aging infrastructure, as we talk about the lack of affordable housing, especially out in the West. The reality is, as superintendent, as a senior executive, I couldn't afford to live in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, were it not for the superintendent's residence. So these are very important realities that we're going to have to own in a second century. In addition, we're going to have to own our physical plant. A lot of the things that were put in by way of assets in Director Hartzog days and Director Manila's days and Stanton and Dickinson, a lot of that infrastructure is aging. I'll never forget when I was running the George Washington Memorial Parkway. If you've ever been to Washington, from Arlington National Cemetery to the Lincoln Memorial is Memorial Avenue Bridge. And I remember the Federal Highway Administration coming in and giving me a briefing and said, Dave, one day, if the Park Service doesn't make an investment, you're going to have issues with that bridge. And if you've been in Washington recently, there's construction on that bridge to take care of it. So our infrastructure is aging. Our campgrounds were designed in the 50s and 60s. Have you seen the latest technology in RVs? Also, what is the visitor experience requiring for campgrounds? When you talk to millennials, when they come into a national park, this is their ranger. They will have everything that they need to make, this is their trip planner. Whereas our generation, we like to go into a visitor center, talk to a ranger, open up a brochure, and plan our day. So the Second Century Park Service has to adapt to all of those changing interests. On Friday, I'll be at a board meeting with the National Park Foundation in Boston. And they commissioned a study on what visitation looks like up into the year 2040. It was done by the Boston Consulting Group. It blew my mind when I got the briefing. By the year 2040, it is projected that visitation to national parks will rise by 200 million visitors. My friends, we have 310 million visitors today, which generated $30 billion, with a B, dollars in economic revenue to gateway communities. 500 million people into our nation's national parks by the year 2040. The students, I'm looking at you right now. You are going to be the leaders at the state level, at the national level, that are going to have to make decisions on how do we meet the tenets of the Organic Act, which every director and every employee pretty much knows, for the use and enjoyment of current and future generations. How are you going to manage that? I don't see that as a challenge, I see it as an opportunity. Part of that dynamic also looks at increases in international visitation, mainly from Asia, followed by India. And I'm often asked, Dave, make the business case for why relevancy, diversity, inclusion is important. Here's a quick war story. I shared with a group earlier this morning that when I was at Grand Teton National Park, I got a call from dispatch. We have 2 contract helicopters in the park and 3 ambulances. We average between 1 to 8 fatalities a year, over 200 medical runs. When you're in a mountain landscape, you can imagine what you will experience by way of tragedies, injuries, falls, fractures, heart attacks, dehydration, and the like. The call from dispatch was pretty frantic. Dave, bus rollover, multiple casualties, all hands on deck. To this very day, I couldn't tell you if that bus was going to Yellowstone or coming from Yellowstone. All I know is that I had multiple injuries and not one person on that bus spoke English. And I had no employees that spoke Mandarin. And you're transporting to the hospital. How do you do triage when you can't speak the language? Fortunately, I had the spouse of a ranger that did speak Mandarin, and she saved lives. Having a workforce that reflects the face of America and reflects current and future visitors is something that we're going to have to own. That's what a second-century National Park Service is going to require. It's not the folks internationally's fault. We have a duty to know who comes through our gates. What are their expectations? What are their experiences in their own country? And how does it differ from when you come to the United States? Can you feed the wildlife? Because in some countries you can. You do that in the United States, and you'll pay a price, potentially. Is our social media reflective of that visitor experience, and is it diverse enough to reach those audiences? These aren't challenges, these are opportunities for us to embrace the visitors that come through our gates. The other thing that's important in the second century is science. I am a huge proponent of social science. And the thing that I constantly talk about with our leaders is science-based decision-making in the natural world and on the visitor experience side. Many of our superintendents now are doing transportation plans and visitor use plans, visitor experience plans. Social science is going to be critical in helping us to achieve what I just mentioned about knowing our audience. Let me give you an example of how I partnered with academia. We were having some pretty serious challenges with illegal immigration from Haiti and Cuba and Everglades. And one particular population, you're treated as a criminal, and another population, the dry foot policy, you're treated differently. All I knew is that when our rangers engaged, we had to put them in the visitor center to allow the Border Patrol to come in and process and do what they needed to do. That directly impacted the visitor experience. And I had graduate students that helped me to understand when I was regional director what that dynamic was all about. What's the information? How many a day? What are their needs so that we can be better prepared to address them humanitarily and from an operational perspective? Our relationships with academia has served us well for many, many years. And a second century Park Service is going to require more of those relationships. Just as it's critical for us to work with our gateway communities, our partners and stakeholders in the philanthropic community, it's equally important that we work with academia. And Clemson and Texas A&M and other universities are examples of that long and storied history of collaboration and cooperation. It's mutually important. So you future leaders out there, as you look at being a part of, at the state level or at the national level, when you look at what it's going to take and what it's going to mean to manage parks, there's going to be a world of opportunity, but also some inherent challenges as well that I truly believe can be overcome. The other thing that I would share with you in the second century is we will tell the stories that have not been told. Let me give you an example. I was the chief ranger at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. We all knew what happened at Appomattox, right? In the 1860s. Lee surrendered to Grant. And here's the thing, too, and I'm not embarrassed to say this because when I talked to a lot of people back in the day when I worked at Appomattox Courthouse, a lot of people like me, when I pulled up as the new chief ranger, thinking, I'm going to go to the courthouse, and there's going to be a table, and there's going to be a chair where Lee sat and where Grant sat. Who's ever been to Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia? Okay, you know that that's not the case. Lee surrendered to Grant in the McLean House, in the parlor of the McLean House, in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. I didn't know that. And yet I was the guy who's going to be responsible for interpretation of the place. Anyway, I'm in the parlor of the McLean House, and I'm learning about what happened. And as a Latino, I began thinking, because I don't remember reading a lot about what Latinos did in the Civil War. There's not a lot of text, narrative in the historic text. And so I started formulating a lot of questions. And it wasn't until I became a regional director during the sesquicentennial of the Civil War that my questions were answered. We did a number of publications during the sesquicentennial. Native Americans in the Civil War, women in the Civil War, Asian Americans in the Civil War, Hispanics in the Civil War, from battlefield to home front, and one of the most, what I thought was going to be controversial publications that wasn't, Slavery, Cause and Catalyst of the Civil War. And I remember the Washington office was looking at how do we go from the Civil War to current day? And they came up with a concept of Civil War to civil rights. I remember getting the call from Washington and said, hey, Dave, you got a lot of Civil War parks in your region. Here's kind of what we're thinking about. What do you think? I said, let me make some phone calls. So I called a couple of my superintendents. I said, folks, how does this narrative play? And two things came up. Dave, let me remind you, dude, you're in the South. Okay, and the second thing was, yeah, we need to talk about those stories. But that first narrative wasn't what you're thinking, and nor what I was thinking. And it was like, Dave, our plans only allow us to talk about the battle. We may or may not talk about the succeeding battle, the next battle. And we sure don't talk about civil rights. That's just not in our enabling legislation. It's not in our interpretive plans. So, we'll do it because, you're the regional director, but you need to think about that. And they were right. We needed to give them permission to talk about that, just as we did with the 400th anniversary commemoration of slavery at Fort Monroe. We sent a directive from Washington to say, 419 units in the Park Service, you find the African American narrative. And I will tell you, my friends, being on the very grounds while that narrative took place, and learning the history of the Tucker family, two slaves that had a child who was the first African American born in what is now, of course, the United States, but the English colonies back then. And that family came to that 400th anniversary. Their cemetery is in Hampton, Virginia. And I met some of their ancestors. Can you imagine carrying that family story to know that your ancestors came off ships right where we're standing in Hampton, Virginia at Fort Monroe? Fascinating. As part of the Hispanic narrative, getting back to the Civil War, I learned that 20,000 of my ancestors fought in the Civil War. I read about the first story of the first Latino to receive the Medal of Honor, not the Congressional Medal of Honor, but the Medal of Honor. He was a Union soldier, flag carrier. Now, what normally happens if you're a flag carrier in the Confederate and the Union forces? You were a target because you were carrying the battle flag of that company and of your nation. This Latino Union soldier, during Pickett's charge in the Battle of Gettysburg, without uttering a word to his commanding officer, rushed through the Confederate lines, seized a battlefield flag, and gave it to his commanding officer and went back into the field of battle. He was the first Latino to receive the Medal of Honor. Why is that important? I had the fortunate pleasure of being in the courtyard of the Pentagon and saw President Reagan bestow the Medal of Honor around the neck of Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavides from El Campo, Texas. He was Westmoreland's driver in Vietnam. He was a Green Beret. We're sitting in a junior college economics class. He was sitting next to me. He hadn't received the medal then. And he was saying things that, oh my gosh, it was like, after class I said, dude, who are you, man? And what's your story? I remember missing the rest of my classes, and he told me his story about how the Army had lost his paperwork, but that he was hopeful one day to get the medal, not for the sake of getting the medal, but because of the benefits to his family. And so I remember writing movie producers just to get his story out, and I think one of the public broadcasting stations broadcasted the story to one of the survivors. He saved multiple lives. He was shot 5 times, survived, the conflict. And that story reached the Fiji Islands and reached one of the members that he saved. It's a fascinating story. I'd like for you to Google or word search, Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavides, and you'll see his citation. It'll bring you to tears of what he went through. But he baptized our son, Anthony. And so Anthony now, as a result of that story, in that book, now knows the story of the first Latino to receive the Medal of Honor. There's another story there about Loretta Velasquez, who was from Cuba. Social means, very wealthy. Her family sent her to New Orleans prior to the Civil War to learn the social graces in the United States. Back in those days, if you had the financial means, you could raise an army. She was a Confederate sympathizer, and that's what she did. And if that wasn't fascinating in and of itself, she did something else. She not only built that company, but she also fought as a man, as Lieutenant Harry Buford. And she owned a slave by the name of Bob. Bob didn't know that she was a woman. If that wasn't fascinating enough, she was so good at what she was doing, and all this is chronicled in her book, which is about that thick, Woman in Battle. She became a Confederate spy. And if that wasn't amazing enough, she was so good at what she did that the Union Army hired her to find the lady dressing up as a man, fighting as a man, as a Confederate spy. It's in the Library of Congress. That's one Latina you just didn't mess with. And at the end of the war, she renounced slavery, she freed Bob, and she talked about the horrors of war. Oh my gosh. The stories of our nation are powerful, they're meaningful. Think about, for the first time, here's the story too that is now being talked about in Indian country. Go back to the parlor of the McLean house. As General Lee is going into the parlor, he sees Colonel Eli Parker. Colonel Eli Parker's Native American. He was a chief. And when he locked eyes with Colonel Parker, General Lee said, "Colonel, it's good to see a true American in the room." Colonel Parker replied, "General, we are all Americans." How many Native Americans today know that one of their own was in the parlor of the McLean house, drafted the surrender terms, and was an eyewitness to history? I would venture to say not many. They do now. We have another opportunity in the Second Century Park Service with the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 2026. I will assure you, my friends, that the National Park Service will be leading the effort to talk about the stories that have not been told. Who was involved in creating this nation? How? Why? And where are we today in becoming an even more perfect union? We will also own the narratives of our workforce today. We will effectively deal with emotional wellness. When I testified before the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, I mentioned that the pride of the National Park Service are our employees. And it doesn't matter if you're a seasonal, a volunteer, or a permanent employee, you're part of this family. The first thing I did on October 1st on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, was filmed a video that we released on my first day in office, thanking our workforce for what they do, empowering them as we move into a second century that we will get better. We will do better. We will own the challenges. We will modernize the National Park Service. We will enhance our business practices. We will improve community engagement. We will tell the stories that have not been told, and we will engage the next generation in a second century. Let me end with something that I use often, and then we're going to ask questions. Back in 1965, there was a publication called Guarding the Treasured Lands, the story of the National Park Service. And it references our first founding director, Stephen Mather. And I have the honor of knowing Stephen Mather McPherson, Stephen Mather's grandson. We were very dear friends. And we talk. He is kind of the custodian of the legacy of Stephen Mather, his grandfather. And what the first director did was it's amazing the correlation with many of the issues we're dealing today, was how do we make our national parks known? How do we protect them? How do we embrace the visitor experience? What is the visitor experience? So the questions the first director had 103 years ago, we still have today. And that's okay. But here's what the author said about Stephen Mather, and I think it's relevant to a second century National Park Service. "And so long as evening campfires burn throughout the land, so long as the park ranger stands beside these wonders of nature and of man, humankind, then will the spirit of Stephen Mather be pleased. For he will know that the National Park Service is keeping the nation's heritage the way he wanted, safe and sound, for the benefit and enjoyment of future generations." Thank you. Absolutely. Good.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for coming to speak. You spoke incredibly passionately and sincerely about the stories and the history of our national parks. In the next 100 years, how are we going to address climate change? What about natural resource extraction? What's your relationship like with BLM?
Absolutely. Thank you. So the recent hurricane, I think just illustrates what may be our paradigm. And we still have a month left in hurricane season, where Cape Hatteras took a direct hit. We literally lost facilities, friends, off the footprint, off the foundation, gone. We lost every single government vehicle and every private vehicle. It took us a number of days to bring teams in to make that community, our park community, whole again. I'm dealing today with not only what happened in the Caribbean, and great folks that are really sharp minds that are helping us to define how do we rebuild, where do we rebuild, and if we rebuild, because of that new paradigm that we're dealing with. I often get asked, David, are we still doing the science? Absolutely, we don't have a choice. Because as leaders of the National Park Service and state park leaders and others, if you're surrounded by water resources, you're going to have to look at how do we effectively mitigate impacts, because they will affect the visitor experience as well. So it is important that we work with academia, that we work with gateway communities, that we work with scientists to help us to better understand what does the next 5 years look like, 10 years, 15, but also what does mitigation look like? And these are tough decisions, but we're going to have to own them and be responsive to them and communicate as well. So thank you for that. Yes, in the back.
A very long question. My daughter is a 4-time seasonal worker with the National Park Service.
Okay.
Why so much so passionate? Oh, thank you. She's so passionate about your mission. She didn't know she wanted to be an interpretive park ranger till about 4 years ago. So it has been, it's been a blessing for me to be able to see her find her career's work. She needs a permanent job, by the way. But
You now know somebody.
yes. She's traveling right now, so I told her I was coming to this lecture today.
Okay.
So she has a very long question for you. This is directly from her, so I'll just read it. She said, what would you say are the fundamental failings within the National Park Service that are leading to situations like we saw at Effigy Mounds National Monument? And how does the National Park Service plan on repairing these shortcomings? And is there anything being done now to protect the mission of the National Park Service from the political greed of the National Park Service? Or, sorry so long, or can we expect more incidences of our country's treasures being exploited by the very people tasked to preserve and protect them? It's kind of a loaded question, I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate that question because I was directly involved in mitigating that particular issue. Because it was a personnel decision, I really can't get involved into how I mitigated it, but I was asked to as associate director. There are a couple of my superintendents around here that I can draw upon. No, I think that's very fair. That's an example, provide a little context, where a leader, and I'm speaking general, I'm not going to speak to that particular issue, but superintendents have a lot of discretion based on the Organic Act and our management policies and principles. And frankly, having been a superintendent in 4 different parks, it's one of the best gigs you can have. But in this particular case, or in general, this is what happens when we don't listen to the subject matter experts on our own team, when we don't effectively engage tribal communities. And not only is it inappropriate, it's not fair to those communities. We have a duty and an obligation to make sure that we understand exactly what we're charged to protect. Yeah, Grand Teton National Park had 24 federal tribes that we dealt with, government to government, because Grand Teton recognized 10,000 years of human footprint. 10,000 years of human footprint. So our ability to effectively engage with tribal nations is extremely important. That's an example where that didn't happen. Another example where, again, a superintendent didn't effectively listen to the subject matter experts and decided to move forward with an operational interest at the expense of the resource. We learned a lot from that experience. We have, in our employee evaluations, we have standards. And if we find situations where that's happening, there are ways where we can effectively mitigate that sooner rather than later. But I think that is an example of how that just further enhanced the sensitivities of doing the right things for the right reasons. And we didn't do it. And as an agency, we learned from it. I would also tell her, be patient, because at the end of the day, it is worth that journey. And sometimes it takes multiple seasons, sometimes it doesn't. I often get asked the question, what's the quickest way to get into the National Park Service? Frankly, it's through the law enforcement ranks. There's a number of opportunities. We have seasonal academies. Silva outside of Great Smoky Mountains. We have Chico, we have in California. There are a number of places. If you're interested in law enforcement, Google Seasonal Law Enforcement Training Academies, National Park Service, and Google whatever mechanism you use. Not plugging any particular site, but, and it'll pull up programs that you can look at. And so what happens when you come out certified for a Type 2 commission, there are two types of commissions in the National Park Service for law enforcement. Type 2 is seasonal, where superintendents issue that federal commission for the summer, and it's only good for that park. A Type 1, which is what I had, my son has that. You're a permanent law enforcement ranger. You can do law enforcement in any national park in the country as a Type 1. And so that's really one of the quickest ways to get in. Another example is to look at urban areas. Urban areas have a lot of attrition, people cycling in and out, the National Mall, Philadelphia. I remember I was a district ranger, I had 40 rangers. Half of them were PhD biologists in a cultural historical park. No problem. They put in their 2 years, became career employees, and then went to Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Teton, the natural areas. The Arch in St. Louis is another gateway park. The gateway parks in San Francisco and in New York is another example. The parks of New York Harbor in New York City. So there are some opportunities to look at through USA Jobs for permanent positions, because you have a number of them and there's a lot of rotation. Yes, ma'am.
With $11 billion of backlog payments for the national park system and federal government support of less than 0.1% of our federal budget for our entire National Park Service, what can we do as members of the public to help try to bridge that gap?
That's a great question. From the inception of the National Park Service 103 years ago, the American citizen has played a very important role in advocacy, but also through their philanthropic dollars and support, through making sure that local communities and elected officials understand and value that this is part of our national birthright. They belong to all of us. And through volunteer efforts. It's amazing the hundreds of thousands of hours that citizens, Americans, provide to their national parks. The philanthropic support is equally amazing. And I think in a second century National Park Service, not at the expense of the appropriation process, but I think we can leverage, I learned this firsthand in Grand Teton, where the value of philanthropic dollars. And what I'm also seeing too, there are philanthropists are also looking at areas that were traditionally identified as inherently governmental, like employee housing. But what the philanthropic community is recognizing that if we're going to attract the best and brightest to be employees of the National Park Service, they have to have housing, right? They have to have a place to stay that provides a quality of life experience. I'll give you an example. There was a bed and breakfast that was in a historic area on Mormon Row in Grand Teton National Park. And to the credit of the Mormon Row residents that occupied that B&B, they came to us first. We went to our foundation. And an anonymous donor bought the property for millions of dollars. Now we're able to provide seasonal housing in the park, protecting that historic footprint and the landscape. Because someone could have come in, raised the historic structures, and built some modern contemporary, which would have been their right to do. So, citizens from around the country are giving of their time and their talents and their passions. And in the Second Century Park Service, as what you do for the Blue Ridge Parkway, we're going to need you. We can't do it alone. And we're going to value what you provide by way of your time, your talents, and your financial resources. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You've spoken quite eloquently about the importance of diversity from the human perspective, both as National Park Service employees and the visitor experience. But one of the roles of the National Park Service, of course, is the protection of the country's natural heritage. Correct. As well. What is the thinking within the Second Century Park Service plan for protecting wild nature in the face of these additional 200 million people that will be visiting?
It's a very good question. Working with our state wildlife agencies is extremely important, especially as the population continues to grow. It may grow within migration routes. I think in Wyoming, Dominic will know firsthand as a former director of the state park system in Wyoming, the path of the pronghorn is a classic example. So being able to work with gateway communities and local landowners to have scenic easements, protective easements, that will enable wildlife corridors to continue to be utilized as they've had for centuries, thousands of years, is going to be critical. So partnerships with our state and game fish organizations, gateway communities, landowners is going to be critical. The science also is critical. We were in Grand Teton National Park working with Yellowstone on the whole grizzly bear management interest, and had a very good working relationship with the states to look at, are they endangered or are they not? Science is going to continue to help us to make those determinations and make the appropriate management decisions as a result. So thank you for that, because I think, we have to have a balance of the natural world and the cultural world, because I will tell you, in many, many places, they're symbiotic. They're tied with each other. Human dynamics and human footprint were direct result of the natural environment, right? Especially migration routes of bison and elk. And so they're critical. And we, in a Second Century Park Service, we cannot afford to have the natural resource world versus the cultural resource world and compete for limited funds and capacity. No, they're symbiotic. We have to focus on providing parity of opportunity for both. It's extremely important we do that. Good time for a couple more? Or are we good? Can I ask the audience, especially for students at Clemson, anybody that's interested in the National Park Service, I want you to ask me a question. If you're about to graduate, okay? Where? There, okay.
Sir, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
What can the National Park Service do, or what are they already doing, to protect themselves from government shutdowns in the future, so we can have a little job security?
Oh, man. Are we at time? It's a good question. I've been through unfortunately, a number of government. It's called lack of appropriations. And I'll tell you, I was associate director for workforce relevancy inclusion when we shut down, well, the National Mall was shut down. And then we realized we're losing hundreds of World War II veterans every day, if not thousands. And they have, I think they call them freedom flights. I think there was one that came in when I landed. And they saved their time and their financial resources. And during one of the lapses of appropriation, the World War II memorial was closed. And we quickly realized that's not sustainable, it's not fair. They may have one shot to visit the World War II memorial. So we learned a lot from that. And so we literally have action plans that, because we've had a number that everyone helps, that takes place, and hopefully, there won't be any additional anytime soon, but we have a game plan as to what we would do. We had governors that would ask us, what is it going to take to keep Grand Teton open? And that actually happened. Not this last one, but the previous one. And we said, okay, here's what it's going to cost to keep a national park open. And they cut checks. And the reason is that they recognize the economic value, but also the quality of life value and the visitor experience. And I give credit to them. So hopefully we won't find ourselves in a situation anytime soon, but if we do have a body of knowledge that we can apply to be able to keep the parks protected and safe. Give you an example that happened in Grand Teton. 2 weeks in the last shutdown, we had an individual that was in a vehicle that was wanting to commit suicide. And we had to shut down the state highway through Grand Teton National Park. And the county that she was from Wyoming, there happened to be an off-duty deputy sheriff that recognized the car and recognized her and gave us some valuable information. So the moral of that story is that even in a lapse of appropriations, these things are going to happen. And you have to have the resources to effectively deal with them. Because at the end of the day, even though parks may be closed, you're not going to close a state highway in the Grand Teton National Park. It's in the heart of the park. And so the park is going to be accessible. So that being the case, you're going to have to respond to potential poaching cases, resource issues, but life and safety.
One more here.
One back there.
One last
Brett.
one.
One more.
Could you please speak about your international collaboration and plans for parks and your program, sister parks or any other, going into this second century, and anything that's mutually beneficial with your other partners?
No, it's a really good question. We do have an international affairs office, and probably at least a couple times a month, I'm approving travel of subject matter experts from the National Park Service going to foreign countries to share, subject matter expertise. I think there's a lot that we can provide to, we have sister park relationships. I know in Grand Teton we had one with Argentina, where we'll share resources with our sister parks. It's something that we're very interested in doing. Give you a quick example. The UK commissioned a commission to study the prospect of having a national system of protected areas in UK, modeled after the National Park Service. And I did an interview with the BBC recently to commend them for at least thinking about the model that served us well for 103 years, but also what we can do to provide technical support and assistance. And so whether it's Africa, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Serbia, we do send subject matter experts to support our related interest. We are truly a world community, and we have a lot that we can learn from each other. My dear friends, I want to take this opportunity again. I'm honored to have had the opportunity to be here, to serve as a lecturer. Hopefully you've had a better sense for where the National Park Service is going in the second century a service, but most importantly, how much we need you. Have a great day.
David, thank you very much for not only your inspired words, but for all the years of service for this country and protecting our nation's most prized and treasured resources. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. There's a small reception in the back to honor David and our award winners this year. And the buses, if you parked at the Mandarin Center, will be starting to run, and you will not be left behind. It'll give you plenty of time to have a cookie and talk with David for a couple of minutes. So if y'all can do that, we appreciate it. And thank you for coming, and we'll see you for the 42nd year next year. Thank you very much.